Hi everyone, and welcome back to Comics and the Graphic Novel. This is going to be our second video and our first video on actual course content. So our last video was about sort of general introductions and welcome and here's the syllabus. This is going to be our video that is actually about comics, which is what you signed up for this course to learn about. So let's get down to talking about what our course is actually going to be about. So, title of the course, Comics and the Graphic Novel, or Comics and Graphic Novels. It's listed both ways on various pieces of Haskell paperwork. Is a course where we're learning about comics and graphic novels. What's the difference there? It's a little tricky, but for now, let's just say that comics is the form. Like when we talk about the novel versus the comics. Comics is this kind of form in a way that we're talking about the novel as opposed to a novel. Comics versus a comic. What is comics? It's a little tricky to define, and we'll talk about this in a couple of weeks when we start reading Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. His entire first chapter, which we'll be reading and talking about, is about how do we define comics, what counts as comics, what doesn't count as comics, how do we come up with a really good definition for it. And as you'll find from that, it's actually really tricky to find a definition that encompasses everything that is comics while not including things that are not comics. So for now, let's just treat comics like the famous Supreme Court decision on, was it obscenity or pornography, where you know it when you see it. Then there are certain kinds of things we associate with comics, and with comics specifically, that we're talking about today. A comic doesn't have to have them, but if it does have these, it's more likely to be a comic. And so we're learning about 5 different pieces of terminology. Before we get into that, though, I'd like to bring up the other part of the title, the graphic novel. What is a graphic novel? What makes it different from comics? There are a lot of different opinions on this subject. When the term was introduced, it definitely meant something different. Nowadays, it tends to be largely folded into comics in general. And so, although we'll talk about the work that first popularized that term, the graphic novel, which is Will Eisner's A Contract with God, when we get to that text. For now, we'll just generally tend to refer to a graphic novel as comics that are collected into some kind of book form, which tends to be how it's used nowadays. And as those are often collecting individual serially released comics issues, whether that's monthly issues in the case of like an American superhero comic, whether that's occasionally weekly chapters in the case of like a Japanese manga. We tend to use that term to refer to those collected collections of the individual parts. And so there's not necessarily a ton of difference in the way they tend to be used nowadays. The other distinction I often hear people kind of draw is that graphic novels for people who are embarrassed to talk about reading comics. There's maybe a grain of truth in that, but that's also kind of a little mean to say. So definitely we'll talk about the term graphic novel in more depth when we get to A Contract with God, and kind of what it originally meant and how it has changed. But for now, when we talk about a comic, we're going to talk about usually a single part, a single chapter, or a single issue, or alternately an entire like comic book run of issues. We talk about comics, we're talking about the entire form, or we're talking about multiple individual things of a comic. So if we talk about comics, like there are three comics that do this, we talk about 3 different, each of them individual comic. And for graphic novel, we'll tend to use that to refer to those collected issues of comics into a book. So we'll be talking a lot this semester about comics as storytelling and the different ways that comics can work. We'll be looking at comics from, obviously, America, but we'll also be looking at comics from other countries. We'll be reading comics from Iran and France, from Japan. We'll be looking at comics from now, as opposed to, or probably nothing super now, but like the 2000s, compared to things in the 1960s or the 1930s, and so we'll be looking at a lot of different kinds of breadth of kinds of comics, different kinds of genres of comic as well. So we're going to probably start off. We're going to start off next week by talking about the history of comics. It's going to be a very Western-centric history, unfortunately, and a very sort of superhero-centric history in the sense that a lot of the ways in which we divide comics up into eras and talk about comics history revolves around superheroes. But nevertheless, we will also be talking about a lot of comics that are not superheroes. If you're not hugely into the superhero thing, we're not just going to do that. So, what I'd like to start us off with, though, is these 5 pieces of terminology that we're going to use to talk about comics, and I'll be referring to them when I talk about different ways the form evolves in my history of comics next week. And the week after that, we're going to talk about an actual comic ourselves, an issue of the comic book Sandman, called Ramadan. And I'll kind of give you the tools you need to kind of walk through analyzing it, and then we'll walk through analyzing it together. At this point, probably still online at that point, so sort of together, not maybe as nicely as we would do it in person. But in order to be able to do those things, we do have to have some shared vocabulary and some way to talk about things that are very uniquely comics. So there are 5 terms that I would like you to know after today's video. Those terms are a panel, the gutter, a speech balloon, and there are various other iterations of that term, a thought balloon, and the same again, and a caption. So let's kind of walk into all of these and look at them kind of individually while looking at them with examples of an actual comic. So let's start off by looking at a panel. So what is a panel? When we tell stories using comics, they tend to be told using images in sequence. And that's how the main way that comics tend to tell a story. They can use text, they don't have to, but they do have to use images. Otherwise, they're not really a comic. Each of those individual images in a sequence that is used to tell a story is a panel. So in this case, often they're separated by like little boxes. So in this case, we have a small panel up here. It's its own little image with this faraway picture of the farm. We have a big panel here showing our heroes kind of getting to know each other. And then we have 3 panels down here, all a little more focused on specific characters. So we have 5 panels on this page. The way panels are set up on the page is going to basically tell us how to read them. And most of us already know how to do this kind of instinctively. With Western comics, you read left to right and top down. So this. Not all comics read this way. And I have another example of a non-American comic, a Japanese manga in translation, A Polar Bear in Love, the sweet story of a polar bear who falls in love with a baby seal. And as you can see, it also is a comic and has a lot of those same things, that we would expect from other kinds of comics. But the interesting thing about Japanese comics is that they read right to left. So with a manga, what looks like it should be the cover is in fact the back cover. And what looks like it should be the back cover is in fact the front cover. And we start from what would normally be the back and then go through until we end up at what would normally be the front. So, So just kind of keep in mind, we have this particular way of reading comics in the West. That's not the way everyone else reads comics, and we will be kind of reading non-American comics and kind of getting to know those other ways of reading as well. But in the meantime, to return to the panel. So each of these images is a panel. Panels are often set aside with boxes, but they don't have to be. And as a kind of, see if we can get a little closer up here. As you can see, this one is in a box. This panel is not really. It's kind of, it's got a little border there, but there's no box up here. There's no border around here. They don't have to have a border, though they can overlap. Certain images can pop out of a panel. Here we see the character, his head is going outside of the panel. So panels, the sort of building block of comic storytelling. Those images that we show in sequence to tell stories, each of those images is a panel. Again, you can have really large panels, you can have small panels. You see they kind of change in size here. You can have panels that are tiny, a lot of them. You can have panels that are a single page or 2 pages. Usually you don't go above 2 pages just because of the way bookbinding works. Like unless you have some like fancy centerfold thing, like a single panel is usually not going to go over 2 pages. But so panels, each of those images is going to be a panel. Panels often have borders. Each panel, because of the limitation of comics and that they're, drawn on a page, represents a single moment in time, usually. Some kind of still image. It can approximate action, but it can never actually show us action because, it can't actually move. Barring some fancy digital thing, an actual comic is just going to be static images. What is interesting about comic storytelling is that all of the actual movement, all of the actual action happens in between those still images, in the parts we don't actually see. We can approximate it by showing a series of still images in sequence that show us different stages of an action, but we never can actually see a movement or an action in comics because they can't move or act. That brings us to our second sort of category, which is the space in between panels, the gutter. Often it is white space, as we see here between these 2 panels. There's just a thin white little strip. It doesn't have to be, though. Sometimes we'll have panels butting up against each other, or here. Sometimes we'll have panels overlapping each other. All of those are also totally legitimate ways of having a gutter. But the traditional gutter we think of is that white space in between boxed panels. We'll learn a lot more about the gutter as we talk about Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. He has an entire chapter on the gutter and closure and how we use the gutter and how comics uses the gutter. But so for now, just keep in mind for the visual storytelling, panels are each of those kind of static images. The gutter is the space in between those images, either actual physical space or a kind of metaphorical space. So that is the kind of visual image-based storytelling in comics. That said, that's not all the kinds of storytelling that comics does. Comics can also, as you can probably know, tell stories using text in addition to those images, and usually do. And so, just as panel and gutter are very much image-based kind of terminology, so our final 3 terms, speech balloon, thought balloon, and captions, are text-based terminology. So they're about how comics use text. So here we have, again with the same page, a speech balloon. We have a lot of speech balloons actually. And they're round usually. They don't always have to be. and they have a tail that points to the speaker to tell you who's speaking, and obviously the words in that bubble tell you what they're saying. Speech balloons are one of the things we most associate with comics, like to the point where like even just adding a speech balloon to something will often make it feel like a comic. And they don't have to be called speech balloons. Even formally, they're often also called dialogue balloons, word balloons, speech bubbles, dialogue bubbles, word bubbles. Like any of those kinds of iterations of those terms, any combination will work. So if you can't remember like the actual name of a speech balloon on, say, an exam or something, I can't remember we're even doing an exam in this course. But you're fine regardless. Speech balloon is just fine, but so is dialogue balloon or speech bubble or word bubble. Use any of those, we'll know what you mean. Why it's interesting is although we have a sort of platonic ideal, like the kind of perfect speech balloon, like this, you can also use speech balloons and these other kinds of text representation we'll talk about to tell a story in the way they're representing the text. And you can kind of see here, you have a character whose speech balloon is kind of wobbly around the edges, and the text in it is smaller. And it basically kind of signifies that this character is kind of like in the process of like passing out, like that they're losing consciousness, and so they're basically their voice is kind of trailing off as they're not doing so hot. When you see speech balloons that are interesting, whether they're in a different color, whether they're like got a different border, where the text is being represented differently, pay attention to that, because what that means is that this character sounds different sounds unusual in some way. In this case, it was that the character, is like not doing well, and so they're sounding not great. But you can also see, sometimes we'll just see like colors reversed. So instead of black text on a white background, it'll be white text on a black background. That might suggest that this character's voice sounds like odd in some way, whether that's like it's awe-inspiring or it's terrifying or something like that. It gets across the idea like there's something out of the ordinary. And this will be the case also for our other ways of representing text. So that then brings us to our second text-based item, and that is going to be a thought balloon. Again, or thought bubble. I don't like any of those work. And in this case, it looks very much like a speech balloon and functions in much the same way, except that it tends to be, at least in Western comics, and really in most comics published in the West, even in translation, tend to be kind of cloud-shaped. It's kind of scalloped around the edges. And instead of an actual tail pointing to the speaker, instead just point to the thinker, you have a series of bubbles. In this case, you have the Hulk thinking about what he's trying to do. And so it's being shown, we're getting his thoughts in the thought balloon. So speech balloons do words, dialogue, speech. Like these are things that are spoken. Thought balloon does thoughts. But we have one other way of representing text. And we'll return back to our previous example. And that is, for our final one, the caption, which is usually shown by text in a box. Again, there are other ways you can represent captions, but this is the sort of standard way. So when we see those captions, they're used for narration in some way. This means if you have some kind of third-person narrator in a story, that's often going to be shown in captions. The thing that says, "Meanwhile, back at the ranch," or "Little did he know that, the radioactive spider was about to bite him," or something that tells us like where we are, or things like that, like a location name. All of these are things that a narration would do, and so when we see those in text or in comics, they're usually text in a box. They're a caption. Because captions can be used for narration, they can sometimes have speech or thought in them as well. If what a character is saying or what they're thinking is being used as narration for either the scene they're in or a totally different scene, that will often also be in captions. I wasn't able to find a good example on short term in this particular volume, but you will often see caption, speech or thought in caption being used kind of like voiceover in a movie. Like it's clearly what someone is saying at some other time usually, but it's being played over this present moment that we're seeing. And that's often how it's used in comics. So, panels and gutters, visual storytelling. The panels are the images, the gutters, the space in between the images. Speech balloon, thought balloon, captions, all ways to represent text. Speech balloon for speech, dialogue, thought balloons for thoughts, captions for narration, which can include speech or thought. So those are the kinds of terms I want us to kind of know, so that we'll be able to, I'll be talking about some of these when I do my video on the history of comics next week, and definitely we'll all be using them the week after when we start doing our initial kind of analysis of the Sandman comic Ramadan. So look forward to our history of comics video next week, and I will see you then.